welcome back. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague and my friend, Professor Penny Andrews. Please make sure you take a moment and read her bio and take a look at some of her work, should you be so inclined. She is respected around the world for the contributions that she has made to the legal community. So, Professor Andrews, I turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you, Professor Burkhalter. Good morning, everybody. Let me begin by welcoming the entering class, the entering one-owls. I welcome you to New York Law School and wish you a successful and rewarding career in the law. Success described very broadly, including happy. I also just briefly want to thank Professor Burkhalter and Professor Thomas, Dean Lapiana, Dean Crowell, for putting together this program and everybody who has been involved behind the scenes in putting together a program which has meant nearly 2 days of really thoughtful and engaging discussion. Lots of lessons learned. It's really been very, very, for me, inspiring, and I hope it has been for you as well. You also received an email from Professor Burkhalter on Friday about the conversation that I'm going to embark on soon with one of New York Law School's most esteemed alums, Louis M. Steele, who has written a very, very engaging book called The Butler's Child, an autobiography. And in the email to you, I said, gave you a caption of the book. And I do encourage you, before you start law school, you still have a little bit of time to read for pleasure. The book is a wonderful exploration of personal and professional challenges in the law, dilemmas in the law, also successes. It's about creating the life of a lawyer, strategies involved, choices made, moral, political, legal choices, and so on, clients, engagement with clients, and even in the autobiography, finding love and raising a family. Mr. Steele, I'm so pleased to welcome you. You muted. So let me ensure that you're not muted as I start the question. The first question that I want to raise with you is, in your book, you really explore the early part of your book, and you mention it continuously throughout the book, your journey from privileged and protected child to a committed civil rights lawyer. And particularly, you mention in your book your relationship with your butler and the housekeeper, Bill and Lorena, as you name them, as a source of influence and even love. So I wonder if you could start by talking a little bit about your journey. All right. Did you hear my question, Louis? Shall I repeat the question?
Yeah. Why don't we start over and you can repeat the question?
Okay. All right. I'm going to start with, I've just mentioned what reading your book, the different themes that you've highlighted, clients, strategy, legal strategy, and so on. But I thought I'd start at the beginning because in your book, you mention your journey, from privileged and protected child of the Warner Empire to your life as a committed civil rights lawyer. And in particular, you constantly come back to your relationship with Bill, the butler, as well as your housekeeper, Lorena. So, and you talk about them warmly, even as a source of love. So I was wondering if you could start by talking a little bit about your journey.
Of course. I think to understand my feelings for them, one has to place me in the time that I grew up in. I'm 84, so I've been around for a while. And as I grew up with Bill Rutherford and Lorena, working in the household that I lived in, at the same time, civil rights and the movement in the United States was exploding, mainly in the South. And so I had developed a very close, I would call it loving relationship, especially with Bill, who seemed to be a protector to me. My brother was the golden boy in the family, and he was my older brother. And so for whatever reason, Bill focused on me. And as the civil rights movement exploded, as the Freedom Riders went south, as they were beaten and their buses were burned, I would look at that on television. And it made me think that something was very, very wrong, even in my own household, with my relationship to Bill and Lorena as I was a young person growing up. And I started feeling that very strongly. And the more I grew up and became a man, the more that influenced me. So there's one little story in the book which very often brings tears to my eyes. I'll try and tell it without the tears, although if I shed a few, I would not be surprised. Bill had given me a nickname, Skippy. And as I grew older, Bill was a Southerner. The family had first employed him when I was a little child in Hendersonville, North Carolina. And so he had grown up in the South. And so he was used to servants taking care of little children and developing a very affectionate relationship with them. But he knew from prior experience that at some point in time, white parents would say to their kids, oh, he's not for you. And they might use some derogatory term. And so Bill was, it's hard for me to imagine, to put myself in another human being, but Bill did not want to go through that pain of withdrawal. And so he started to change my name from Skippy, which was what he had given me, to Lewis, and finally to Mr. Lewis. And that was very painful for me, to the point where I went to Lorena. By that time, when the change was really complete, I went to Lorena and said, you know, it's so painful. And she told me, given his background, he can't do anything else. That's just the way he is. He still cares about you, but he's in effect protecting himself. And so that was always in the back of my mind and influenced me as soon as I graduated from New York Law School, where I must say I did quite well.
You were editor of the Law Review.
Yeah, I had some interviews for jobs, but I screwed them all up. I'm sure consciously on purpose, volunteered for the NAACP, and that's how I became a civil rights lawyer.
So this relationship was clearly formative and had you thinking very, very early on in your life about race and power and relationships and so on. So I wonder if I could move forward and ask you a question about another relationship, which was very, very important in your life. And that is with the highly esteemed and great civil rights lawyer and then federal judge, Robert Carter, whom you met when he was counsel at the NAACP. And for students who may not be aware of this, Robert Carter was one of the architects with Thurgood Marshall of the Brown versus Board of Education, the litigation. And I know that you had a lifelong, very important relationship with Robert Carter. So I wonder if you would mind if you spoke a little bit about your relationship with Robert Carter, and particularly you share in the book again, your anxieties and your uncertainties as a white man in this very, very intimate relationship with this Black man who was also such an important civil rights lawyer and with whom you shared civil rights values.
Well, one thing in the beginning that I would like to share with you, when I first went to the NAACP, other than my relationship with Bill and Lorena, I literally had no relationships with any person of color. None. You didn't develop any relationships in school because the kids were all white, especially if you came from a privileged class and you ended up in private schools. So I started working for Robert Carter, who had won 21 out of 22 cases in the United States Supreme Court. He was an extraordinary man. And we were in this was 1964, when the Civil Rights Act, the first 1964 Act, was passed. We were Robert Carter, who was general counsel of the whole organization and all its chapters all over the country, two other lawyers who were there, one Black and one white, and me. And Carter was trying to move forward a huge agenda, bringing, for example, school segregation from the South to the North, which meant developing a whole theory that did not involve the type of intent that existed in the southern states of the old Confederacy. And so Bob would have meetings with just the four of us, including me in. And as those meetings went forward, I started seeing him as this not only great litigator, but an incredible man. He would actually listen to me. And he would listen to the three of us. And if we had any ideas as to how to move a particular case forward, he would evaluate them. And if there were pieces of those cases, he would pull them in. And for me, once I got in that environment, it was an environment that literally demanded all of my time. Literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Wherever Carter wanted me to go, I went. Whatever case he wanted me to handle, I handled. If I needed help, the two more senior lawyers would give me that help, but they were extraordinarily busy too. So part of my relationship with him came from that work environment. And I think he saw me as a person who would go to any ends to both please him, because he was my boss and knew infinitely more than I could imagine myself knowing, and help the clients that he had me work with. And so he gravitated toward me as I gravitated toward him. And that became a lifelong relationship. It developed so that he was mentor and he became father figure. If I want to be psychological, I suppose what I would say as Bill Rutherford withdrew to some extent from his relationship with me, Robert Carter became the father figure that Bill had been in many ways before. And then he became a friend and a lifelong friend, and really developed an extraordinary affection for Kitty, my lifelong companion, wife. Whatever you want to add to that is appropriate. And he pulled her in as well. He and his wife, Gloria, and I became lifelong friends of their two children, one of whom is a state court judge, still sitting today in the Bronx.
I want to continue this pursuit about, the point that you had raised, how you met Robert Carter and your engagement with the civil rights movement, starting with your volunteering at the NAACP. You graduated from law school and it was admitted to the bar, I think, late 1963, early 1964. And that would have been
that's right.
Yeah. You said you got your letter in the fall of 63 about bar passage. So, but 1963, 64, so on the verge of the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 10 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Lots of interesting developments in the country. Dr. Martin Luther King is out there speaking, and the civil rights movement is in full flourish. So it must have been an incredibly hopeful and optimistic period as you sort of embarked on your legal career. I wonder if you could compare that particular moment with today, when we have, again, a focus on sort of unfinished business of civil rights. And I would say that this is probably the opposite period of that moment, or so how do you compare this moment to the time when you started practicing law and the civil rights movement then?
Well, first of all, we have to focus on the North, because what Carter did is say, we've got to bring the civil rights movement north. We have to attack school segregation in public schools up here, which was almost as bad as it was in the South. We have to attack craft unions up here that were all white. We have to attack ghetto housing up here, which is totally segregated. Most African Americans can't move out of ghetto areas in the North. We have to do all of that work. So on the one hand, yes, it was exciting to be at this point in time where new laws were being passed to break down Jim Crow. But in the North, the resistance was intense. It was so intense that you looked at it and you said, why don't they understand? And their attitude was these civil rights laws in the 1960s were passed to break down Jim Crow, which was essentially a Southern problem. And a lot of our focus, although Bob Carter did send me down south from time to time, a lot of our focus was taking on cases in the North before federal judges who couldn't understand at all what we were complaining about. So that I just want to lay that out. The North was in total resistance of a different nature, not resistance trying to keep Jim Crow, but resistance trying to keep their segregated way of life with white supremacy written large. So we did make some progress, not much, but we made progress. In '68, for example, Bob had me go to Columbus, Ohio, and try an amazing theory where our job was in court, in federal court, to have a federal judge stop the building of a publicly funded science building at Ohio State University. The case was Etheridge versus Rhodes. And he turned it over to me. And I actually had learned so much from him. I said, well, let's use experts to show how a totally segregated workforce at a building like this in the center of Columbus, Ohio, would affect young African Americans who would walk by the building all the time and seeing a white workforce. So we used experts to do that. So we made some progress, not what we should have made because the resistance was so strong among the federal judiciary at the level right beneath the Supreme Court. And that led eventually in 1968, led me to write the article, which I do discuss in the book, 9 Men in Black Who Think White. And you could see the Supreme Court closing down and becoming the very, very conservative court that existed way back to the beginning of time, really. You know, you can go back to 1857, where the Supreme Court said that slaves or Black people literally could never become citizens in the United States, and no matter where they lived, could never have any citizenship rights. So that goes all the way back. And literally from 1968 on, in 1968, you had Martin Luther King being assassinated. You had Bobby Kennedy being assassinated. You had Nixon being elected, and you had a real return to stagnation. Stagnation's really too easy a word, to retreat and stagnation. No more progress. No more even thinking of progress. Law and order was being asserted. In the South as well as the North, the prisons were being filled up with Black and Latinos. So if you look at today, you take that all the way up to today, when you start seeing the reaction to the Floyd murder, that sparked all of the rebellions that have been taking place in the last few years, you see stagnation, no progress. And you see when organizations like the Black Panthers sprung up, you see the FBI and local officials either dragging them into court immediately or in some cases killing them. So that's what was going on until the Floyd murder really struck a chord. It was so vicious and so clear that it created almost the same feeling that the police dogs and the water hoses and the burning of the buses and all that was going on in 63, that came alive again to some extent. And from my perspective, looking at it, seeing white kids and black kids and white adults and black adults walking together made me feel that maybe this could be a period of a new reconstruction.
Yes, I want to be, before I continue, if anybody wants to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat, okay? Yes, Louis, I want to continue this. You know, you mentioned the South. Everybody focused on the South. Brown was about segregation, but that for Judge Carter, the North was similarly problematic, and segregation was deep in the North. It was more subtle and arguably more institutionalized. It reminds me of the, your article, 9 Men in Black Who Think White, makes me think of Malcolm X's comment that anything south of the Canadian border is the Deep South. But I want to continue this issue around policing. Your first chapter in the book is about Attica, a sort of transformative moment, we thought, in the prison system and policing, corrections, etc. Why did you choose to make Attica the first chapter of the book? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Attica moment and today with, sort of Black Lives Matter, calls to defund the police, etc., etc.
Well, I had been doing prison work prior to Attica. In The Butler's Child, I discuss what occurred at another New York prison, Auburn, which led up to Attica. But why was Attica the first chapter? It was so intense and so painful, really, to go up there and be an observer and spend 3 or 4 days up there. It was really 3 days. Closer to 4, trying to figure out if there was anything that could prevent the massacre that occurred. And we couldn't do that because Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor of New York at that time, had much higher political ambitions. In fact, he was the one that created the Rockefeller laws that loaded up our prisons, filled our prisons. So it was the intensity of Attica that the publisher's people said, this should be the first chapter. And I could see how you could segue from that chapter back. And so I said, great idea, let's do it that way. But in my mind, when I originally laid out the book, I did it much more sequentially. But there was Attica, and Attica was so horrendous that the public became aware of it to some extent, at least, because the authorities had lied and said that when the prison was retaken in the massacre, the prisoners had killed the guards, had slit their throat of all the guards that they had held during the uprising and during the time they controlled a large part of the prison. None of that happens. And so you had the headlines in the New York Times. We talk about false news. This was false news fed to the media in 1970, which actually 1971, 50 years is the remembrance in September of the Attica Rebellion and Massacre. You have Nelson Rockefeller. By the way, I've already mentioned Etheridge versus Rhodes. My welcome to the NAACP was Robert Carter arguing the very same type of case, attacking both Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller as governor of New York, and the liberal mayor of New York City, Mayor Wagner, for building all sorts of public buildings in New York with whites-only union labor. And so Carter had developed the theory back then that these are city and state officials. They're supposed to obey the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. They overlook it. They pretend it doesn't exist. And so you have all these buildings going up with all white labor forces. So I was in court for one of the first times after becoming a lawyer. Carter was arguing the case. And I looked up at the ceiling in the courtroom, and there was this glass window commemorating Chief Justice Taney, who was the very Chief Justice who wrote the Supreme Court decision, which said that Black people could never become citizens, no matter where they live. And we're in New York City, and he's up on the ceiling, and Carter is arguing this case before a panel of 5 judges. By the way, one of whom was Black, 4 were white, and when he lost there, the one Black judge went along with the 4, because unless you have enough Black representation or brown representation, the whites overwhelm it anyway. And so all he could say is, well, you know, the court could take judicial notice. In other words, without any other proof that these unions were segregated. But it made no difference. And Bob eventually argued that in the highest court of the state of New York, where we had been told there were great legal scholars. And those great legal scholars voted 7-0 to kill Carter's theory. And fortunately, we had a second chance in Etheridge versus Rhodes in federal court in Ohio, and won that case. But that was 3 or 4 years later.
That was very disappointing to read about the court, the New York Court of Appeals, rejecting Carter's argument. I think Judge Kay was the Chief Justice at the time, and they were supposed to be liberal, mostly liberal justice. I want to pursue this, but I've got some questions in chat. So I wonder if I could just go to the questions from Yasmin. The question is, did Mr. Rutherford live long enough to see your career as an attorney? What were his thoughts?
I think so. What his thoughts weren't really articulated. Lorena would articulate the thoughts for both of them from what I could see, and she was as proud of me as if I was her own child.
Yeah, that level of love is so poignant and moving, and he would have been proud. Let me go to the next question from Gillian. Mr. Steele has had a lengthy, dedicated career trying to attain greater equality and justice for all. How has he seen and additionally influenced himself via his own life's work, the changes to policy which have been most effectual in getting to where we are today? So in other words, have you seen yourself affecting policy? That's how I understand Gillian's question.
You know, on a limited, very limited level, winning that case, Etheridge versus Rhodes, which was never appealed, by the way, but it was one of the cases that undergirded affirmative action. And so when I look back on it, even though it was hard to get the judge to move forward after he wrote this wonderful opinion in that case, by the way, and had it come down on the same day that Brown versus Board of Education came down, May 17. So you knew that he understood what he was doing, but the politics kind of enclosed him. And so, like federal judges over and over again, they slow everything down. And so while I was still at the NAACP, I didn't see the progress that I wanted to see. On the other hand, when people started trying to use affirmative action to make some inroads into the craft unions, that case played a role. So there were some victories in school segregation. I actually won a case that I tried in Kokomo, Indiana. And that was an interesting case because the judge was so conservative that when I first went out there, he literally wouldn't give me any time to discover the facts. Said, oh no, we've got to try this case in 3 months because there are buildings that people want to build and therefore craft unions that want to work on the building and money involved, blah, blah, blah. And I won that, by the way, in terms of having people understand the vagaries of litigation, and all our students here today should understand that. There is a vagary in litigating a case which you never understand until you do it. In that case, I had put on a mother of one of these children to talk about the two 99% Black Kokomo schools that were terrible, especially if you compared them to the white schools. and my adversary was cross-examining them. And after she went through all of the stuff about the inferiority of the schools, he asked her on cross-examination, by the way, do you have anything else to complain about? And she answered, yes, they taped one little girl's mouth closed, who was 5 years old, because they didn't like the teacher didn't like what she was saying. And that infuriated the judge, and it allowed me to open up the trial. We visited the school, and he closed those schools down.
Thank you. Now, I know we've got somebody's raised their hand, but I've just got another question that I wanted to ask you from Andre. You do mention in the book that when you wrote the article in the New York Times, 9 Men in Black Who Think White, you were fired from the NAACP. So Andre has asked this question. Can Mr. Steele dive into the article he wrote and why he was fired from the NAACP? Having read the article, there didn't seem to be anything in it that would amount to a fireable offense. Why was the NAACP so hostile to the article? Thank you, Andre.
Well, there was a competition going on at the NAACP at that time between the old guards, and they were the old timers who were on the board, and the so-called Young Turks, who, to my mind back then, weren't terribly young, but they were in their 40s and 50s instead of their 60s and 70s and maybe 80s. And Carter had identified with Young Turks. And not that he did anything in his official capacity, but his friendships were with the younger people. And Roy Wilkins, who was the executive director of the NAACP, was really not very happy on that. And so that was going on. The other thing that was going on is Carter was open to taking cases which the organization, or at least Wilkins and his hierarchy, viewed as threatening. So there was a Black Power movement starting up at that time. And in New York City, especially in an area that was a Black area in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, there was a local public school board that actually had taken authority away from the main school board based on a statute which had been passed saying, oh, we should have more local control. The people were, at least in terms of their rhetoric, Black Power people. And they were tired of the old-time teachers in the school not teaching their kids, and they were going to shake that up. And so they told the main school board, we're taking these teachers out and we're replacing them with young teachers who want our kids to learn. Well, a lot of those teachers that were being taken out were Jewish, although at least half of the replacements, the young kids who were teachers, were also Jewish. But the main school board and the unions and the Africa and the Jewish organization saw that as total anti-Semitism. And so Carter was in conflict with Wilkins on that. And Carter had assigned me to go out and do what I could do to help that school board. And so Carter really became the target. I was fired without any notice to him. And by then, people in the organization said, oh, Lewis and Bob have a terrific relationship. Lewis does anything, goes anywhere Bob wants him to go to. And so in terms of how I had thought about it then and now, and how the Young Turks thought about it, the attack on me was really an attack on Bob. I was fired without them even picking up the telephone and saying, Bob, you know, we're thinking of firing Lewis. What do you have to say about that? He and I had lunch that day. 9 Men in Black was in the New York Times that day. So he was giving me a lunch to congratulate me for writing what he thought was a terrific article. And at the end of the lunch, we're at a Chinese restaurant. He said, oh, I've got to go over to the Hilton Hotel where we're having a board meeting today. So he went over, I went back to the office, and there's a little note on my chair from a friend of mine in the PR department who said, Lewis, you've just been fired. I looked at the note and said, oh, that's a funny joke. I was a young attorney. I now had this big article in the New York Times magazine. I was kind of overproud, but that was an achievement that I thought, and I liked it. And so I went back to working, and about 10 minutes later, the phone rings, and Carter's at the Hilton Hotel, and he says, Lewis, you've just been fired. And I said, yeah, I just heard about it. He said, don't worry about it. We'll overturn it, and everything will be fine. So he said, I'll talk to you after the board meeting when I come back to the office. He comes back to the office and said the board would not change the vote on that. So that's a long story, but it's probably the story that has some real value to it. I mean, there's another piece of it. Carter should have been made the head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He was not only Thurgood Marshall's right-hand man, he was the intellectual impetus of Brown versus Board of Education. He was the person who argued first before the Supreme Court in Brown. Bob was an enormous legal scholar, and he was a great litigator. And, you know, to treat him like that was an ultimate insult. And so he, when he couldn't overturn it, resigned, as did the attorneys on the legal staff. We had about 4 or 5 at that point in time.
I suppose that with some firings are indeed honorable. Josh had asked exactly sort of the similar question. So Josh, I think your question was answered. And Professor Thomas put an interesting note in chat where she says that she read the 9 Men article as a critique of the triumphal story of the civil rights litigation, and it resonates with a critique in critical race theory. If we have some time, I don't know if we have time just to talk a little bit about Derek Bell, but I see that Natalie had a hand raised. So Natalie, why don't you unmute yourself and ask the question? I think I saw Natalie. I can't, for some reason, I'm not able to actually see who raised their hand. There was just a notice across the screen. Was it Natalie? Whoever raised their hand, you want to just ask the question, unmute yourself and ask the question? Okay, maybe there's a technical problem. So let me sort of continue. It's very interesting. I think that it's right that there is at the moment the sort of, we know the triumphal story of the civil rights movement and law changes everything, but we know that legal change doesn't necessarily sort of transform into political, economic, social change. And this is part of the problem. Now we have the unfinished business of civil rights. So I wanted to ask you about Derek Bell.
Not only have the unfinished business, you've got the explosive anger. And you really see that on two levels. One, among a certain segment in the African American community, although I must say they have overall African American leaderships have tried to maintain forceful, direct type action, but totally peaceful. And the white community, which a certain presidential candidate and president activated in order to run his campaign, which in many ways looked like Nixon's and Reagan's Southern strategy. So you've got a lot going on, but I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, in fact, I've got a note from our chair, Professor Burkhalter, that I've got to start winding things down.